She once was so afflicted, according to her doctors, that she saw coffins floating past, and on another occasion feared that when women at court had moles on their faces, that worms would emerge. She was clearly suffering from an extreme fear of death. The English like queens, said Victoria's grandmother, the Duchess of Saxe-Coburg, when the future queen was born. It has to be said this was a bold statement in the early 19th century, an age which condemned Elizabeth I for executing her cousin, Mary Queen of Scots, and really criticised Queen Anne for not continuing the royal line. Poor Queen Anne, she tried her best. Even the new young royal's name, Victoria, was meant to signify she would never be queen. I'm Kate Williams, and in this episode of my History Extra Academy series exploring the lives of some of the greatest queens from history, I'll be delving into Queen Victoria's life and reign. We'll explore how this minor female royal, born fifth in line to the throne, became one of the longest reigning and most consequential monarchs in British history. When she was born in 1819, Victoria was a very long way away from the throne, a girl from the start and the daughter of the fourth son of George III. Well, her father did not think so. The Duke of Kent said, "My brothers are not so strong as I am. The crown shall come to me and my children." He also described his new daughter as more of a pocket Hercules than a pocket Venus, and as plump as a partridge. He clearly saw she was a healthy little survivor. Well, he was wrong about the throne coming to him, but he was right about his children, his child, Victoria. She was christened Alexandrina for the Russian Tsar, her godfather, and then she was given Victoria, the anglicised version of her mother's name, Victoire. It was a French name, and this is being given to a child born almost 4 years after the end of the bitter wars with France. It's a bit like calling a child Kylia if we'd been at war with Australia for the last 15 years, fearful they were going to invade. Victoria later said that, "I am the first person ever to be called Victoria. There were a few others in the parish records before her, but she's the first significant Victoria, we might say." And this name, given to her by the Duke of Kent's brother, not by the Duke himself, it's meant to signify this is a strange name, a weird name, and this child will never come to the throne. The Duke of Kent died in 1820 when Victoria was still an infant, and when her grandfather, George III, died soon afterwards, Victoria was propelled into third in line to the throne. Her uncle became king as George IV, and then she had 2 other uncles after him. One, the Duke of York, died in 1827 when she was a child, and she soon moved up to first in line when William IV came to the throne in 1830. The new king soon looked to evolve Victoria's status, attempting to give her her own household and separate her from her extremely controlling mother and the even more controlling figure in her mother's household, John Conroy. There were also discussions about changing her name to something more regal like Augusta or maybe Charlotte. But on this, both Victoria and her mother stood firm. The name would stay. And this wasn't the only way that Victoria's mother was a rigid, overseeing force. Victoria was subject to what was called the Kensington system, a way of governing her during her childhood in Kensington Palace. She was managed with an iron fist. Victoria was watched. She wasn't allowed ever to be alone in case she came up with some new ideas, not even allowed to sleep alone. And John Conroy, the former equerry to the Duke of Kent, really manipulated Victoria's mother into absolute obedience to him, and he tried to force Victoria into submission throughout her early adolescence, demanding that she give up power to her mother and him when she became queen. What they really wanted is for her to come to the throne when she was under 18, and the Duchess would be regent with Conroy behind her. Even when she fell seriously ill with typhoid fever, aged 16 at Ramsgate in Kent, they tried to compel her into giving position to Conroy. But Victoria, despite her awful illness, stood firm, refusing to give Conroy further influence. William IV was determined to deny power to the Duchess and Conroy. He asked his doctors, just wind me up, until she turns 18. And when young Victoria reached the age of 18, legal adulthood, the Duchess and Conroy knew they had lost. Just over 4 weeks after her 18th birthday, William IV died. Victoria was queen, the most powerful woman in the world, the most wealthy woman in the world, only just 18. She asked first for an hour alone because she'd never had an hour alone before. And then she asked for her bed to be moved from her mother's room. It was a clear message to the Duchess. You have played the game and you have lost. The problem of the Queen's husband, as in that he owned everything, had been solved for Victoria by Queen Anne, who, when she came to the throne in the early 18th century, had not given her husband the status of king, and he had declared himself her subject. But still, the Married Women's Property Act was many years in the future. It wouldn't come into effect until the second half of Victoria's reign, and so still at this point, in the first half of the 19th century, a woman's property on marriage became absorbed into that of her husband's. She owned nothing in her own right. There are some really moving wills from the time in which men leave their wives their own belongings, like shoes and hairpins and combs, because otherwise, officially speaking, all of that woman's belongings would be possessed by her husband's heir. So, how could a queen marry? But Victoria had to marry. This was made very clear to her when she arrived on the throne. She was 18, unsure of marriage. But the horror, some saw it, of female rule had to be dampened somehow, made acceptable to the growing middle classes of the 19th century. There is this really telling, fascinating cartoon of around the time of Victoria's coronation in 1838, in which two female characters, Kitty and Joan, they delight in the wonders the new queen will do, all in favour of the women. As they say, there will be a parliament of women and an act passed that all women, married or single, are to have a roving commission to go where they like, do as they like, and work when they like. And they even get a gallon of cream of the valley each to drink health to the Queen. What fun! But clearly quite terrifying to Britons in the 1830s that women might do as they like, or work when they like, or even indulge in the bodily excess of drinking a gallon of cream of the valley. And you know that's code, because cream of the valley was a slang term for gin. Oh my goodness, you have women working when they want, going when they want, married or single, and drinking gin. And that's all because they've seen a woman on the throne. So Victoria, this independent queen, had to be shaped into the image of female gender acceptability, the stalwart, the embodiment of the sentimental domestic marriage. The young queen was told firmly that marriage was the only way that she might no longer live with her mother, because a single woman has to live with her mother, otherwise it's not decent. And there were various conflicts with the Duchess of Kent, including a scandal over a sadly dying lady-in-waiting, and Victoria was keen to escape. She soon proposed marriage to her cousin, Prince Albert of Saxe, Coburg and Gotha, born into German nobility, but totally penniless. Now, Albert hadn't always impressed Victoria before. On one meeting, he'd fallen asleep in his plate after the exhausting balls at the English court. But Victoria knew she had to marry, and this was her only option. Now, there were some objections to the match. The Queen's Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne, said, marriages between cousins, not a good thing, and many thought she should marry a British man. Nevertheless, the match was made, and the plan was for a giant royal wedding. Now, before Victoria, royal weddings had usually been evening affairs, and the bride could wear any colour, and all weddings were comparatively modest, with indeed the brides across the country wearing all kinds of colours, including black for mourning. But Victoria and her ministers wanted to make the wedding into this great vision of innocence and purity to show the contrast between Victoria and those scandalous Hanoverian uncles who'd gone before. She would be driven by horse and carriage to the wedding at St James's Palace during the day so everyone could see her, and she chose to wear a white dress, a sight that was a bit baffling to many spectators who thought she was wearing her nightgown. Albert, some people thought, looked a bit like he was wearing borrowed clothes. And there was even a rhyme saying, "Here comes Albert, for better or worse, for England's fat queen and even fatter purse." But the whole thing, the white wedding, the giant royal wedding, it caught on like wildfire, and the Victorian middle-class wedding became a festival of purity, symbols of white and spending. The ideal of the royal wedding as a way of capturing public loyalties, even bigger than the coronation. The fact that weddings get bigger and bigger and bigger. Cakes, marquees, bridesmaids, giant dresses. We can blame Victoria for the lot. Victoria insisted, against the advice of her ministers, on promising to obey Albert in her wedding vows. Except she never did. Victoria and Albert immediately set about building a family, and their first daughter, known for her mother but known as Vicky, was born in 1840. And they didn't stop there. Queen Victoria's large family of 9 was transformed into sentimental domestic images for the nation and the empire to consume, many of which were painted by the Queen herself. Indeed, Victoria was a best-selling author because her book, Leaves from the Journal of Our Life in the Highlands, her diary of Scottish travels, published between 1846 and 1861, was a sensation. And after that, everyone in Victoria's circles had to travel to Scotland. And we have to thank Victoria for not just white weddings, but also the Christmas frenzy. Until Victoria's rule, Christmas had been quite a low-key celebration, usually for adults, and although the Victorians were creating it anew, there was little orthodoxy about how to celebrate. When a picture of Albert, Victoria and their children with a Christmas tree appeared on the front of the Illustrated London News in 1848, the Christmas tree craze began in Britain with a vengeance, at the same time swiftly followed by the invention of the Christmas cracker and the mass production of the Christmas card. White weddings and Christmas, mince pies in the shops in August, it's all Victoria's fault. Despite the clear precedent laid down by Queen Anne, it wasn't straightforward for Victoria and Albert. They were engaged in a constant battle for power. Albert had hoped to be something of a joint monarch, like William and Mary in the late 17th century. But Victoria made it clear he would be consort. The only time when he seemed to win was when she was pregnant, for plans must be made for who would govern the country in her absence, with Albert as a quasi-regent. He used it to his advantage, moving towards a takeover when Victoria was essentially in the late stages of pregnancy and the early throes of motherhood. Not that the country knew this, or anything of Victoria's experience of postnatal suffering. She once was so afflicted, according to her doctors, that she saw coffins floating past, and on another occasion feared that when women at court had moles on their faces, that worms would emerge. She was clearly suffering from an extreme fear of death. The country was sold a vision of a happy, domestic queen, which, admittedly, the queen herself did much to shape. Victoria is Britain's most painted queen. She was on biscuit tins, cups, souvenir items, portraits, newspapers, magazines. She understood the power of representation, the importance of royal spin. The image almost mattered more than reality. Victoria is often thought of as a dour queen, never amused. In fact, she wrote in her diaries, "I am very, very, very amused." But in the photographs taken after Prince Albert's death at the age of 42 in 1861, she is really walking the line of what is acceptable as a widow. But despite how we see her, the image that prevailed through much of her reign was the vibrant young mother of a very happy family. And this image was used to encourage the expansion of the Victorian economy and the empire machine. This sentimental vision of Victoria was pushed across the British Empire, imposed on female monarchs who resisted British control, such as Ranava of Madagascar, who was repeatedly told she was unfeminine and monstrous next to Victoria and was given portraits of the Queen as an exemplar. Victoria's image grew to be all-powerful as she became symbolic of an expanding and oppressive empire through which other queens and monarchs lost their power. Speaking of a loss of power, the English may like queens, but we can also see a pattern through history of monarchy losing its power under queens. Elizabeth I's reign saw a significant progression in the power of Parliament and indeed the status of her advisers, who enacted the execution warrant on Mary Queen of Scots without Elizabeth's knowledge. And of course, she was under constant pressure to marry. In a similar fashion, in the course of Victoria's reign, the role of the monarchy was much reduced. The Hanoverian monarchs had been far more tyrannical, but by the end of Victoria's reign, it was constitutional monarchy par excellence, allowing the monarch to advise and warn. As one scholar, Ariane Chernock, has written about Queen Victoria, misogyny played no small role in modernising the monarchy. It is not a coincidence, if you ask me, that Walter Bagehot's The English Constitution, first serialised in 1865 and published in 1867, explains that the monarch should be able to warn, advise, and be consulted. As he put it, the Queen's value is incalculable, although only used in a dignified capacity. His book was used to define Victoria and also used to unseat other queens like the Queen of Madagascar, who was not deemed to be behaving in a dignified capacity. And it's an interesting dichotomy, isn't it? Because in terms of history, most of us would support the idea that monarchy should be constitutional, but still, how interesting that it makes its greatest progresses in the reigns of women. I think we can say there were efforts to force Victoria to be something of a cipher, but she fought back. She didn't always believe the information she got from her male advisors and politicians. She wrote directly to people on the ground across the empire, often corresponding directly with ambassadors' wives. She knew that the men around her were trying to exclude her. Many around her wanted to make Victoria their puppet. The image of happy womanhood, of procreative motherhood, while the power of the monarchy was gradually eroded. One interesting myth that pervades about Victoria's power is that when sex between men was outlawed in 1885 as gross indecency, ministers chose not to outlaw sex between women because Victoria thought it was too shocking to contemplate. In fact, the Queen did not have this power to veto. What really happened? The politicians decided not to ban sex between women because they feared giving women ideas. As one lord put it, the mere discussion of subjects of this sort in the minds of unbalanced people would lead to creating the idea of an offence of which the enormous majority have never even heard. i.e., women were easily influenced, unbalanced, and, well, put an idea into their heads and they're just going to do it. Very easily dissuaded from having sex with men. Horrors! On the 22nd of January 1901, Queen Victoria died at Usborne House on the Isle of Wight. After 63 years on the throne, she was the longest reigning monarch in Britain and the longest reigning queen regnant in the world, until Elizabeth II, her great-great-granddaughter, passed her in 2015. Like other significant women of the 19th century, Victoria corresponded just enough to prevailing norms, manoeuvring within them to gain power, and often, we might say, like contemporary writers, Charlotte Bronte, George Eliot, she used contemporary dress to veil unconventional attitudes. And yet, as the age wore on, the young, independent Victoria came to endorse and support the norms themselves, instructing her daughters and granddaughters, telling women how to behave. The Queen declared the idea of votes for women a wicked folly. And yet, dealing with her prime ministers, she was acute, perceptive, and avidly interested in current affairs. And, well, there's something of an irony, because when it came to the campaign for female suffrage, the campaigners repeatedly used Victoria as an example par excellence of how politics was not beyond female understanding. The Queen was a woman entrusted with the most complicated political questions, and thus, if a queen could oversee politics from the age of 18 no less, then surely a woman could vote. Held up as such an example, why did Victoria herself not see the opportunity for women to have a greater say in how society was governed? As Queen, Victoria had to intersect with expectations of feminine respectability, and the vote was not respectable. Even if she'd personally agreed with votes for women, it would have diminished her own power to say so. And because over history there's a pattern that we see, queens must be careful not to do too much for women. There is the fear, as we saw above, that a female monarch might bring in opportunities for women to do as they like, let alone drink gin. With Victoria's reign, the Queen had become the symbol of domestic contentment, a powerful image at the same time as monarchy became increasingly ceremonial. Victoria, the longest reigning monarch who really had to battle in her way to get the throne, she was turned into an image of the happy domestic queen and push a hierarchy, particularly in the middle classes and across the empire. And the great irony of Victoria was that she, this politically astute monarch who had the measure of her many male politicians, that her image was used to push forth the importance of something that she and her male advisors would never have supported. And that was votes for women.